LeBron James went on a podcast and said something that most people would call reasonable at first listen. He said that playing 82 games in the 80s and 90s is not the same as playing 82 games in the 2020s. Simple enough, right? Just a player talking about how the game has changed over time, how the pace is different, how the physical demands on the body are different, how injuries happen in new ways now compared to back then. On the surface, that sounds like something any trainer or sports scientist might say in a normal conversation. But here's the thing. Not everybody heard it that way, not even close. And the people who heard it differently were not random people on the internet. They were legends, players who built their names in exactly the era LeBron was talking about. And one of them, one of the biggest names in NBA history, was not willing to just sit back and let it go. Shaquille O'Neal heard those comments, and Shaq, a four-time champion, a man who played through some of the most physical basketball this league has ever seen, he did not take it lightly. Reports came out that after the Lakers and Knicks game, things got tense in the tunnel. Not polite, not casual, tense. And when you hear about Shaquille O'Neal, a man standing at 7'1" and around 300 pounds, intentionally stepping into someone's path in a tunnel to make a point, you know right away that whatever was said on that podcast had hit a nerve way deeper than most people realized. So let us actually break all of this down properly, because the context here matters a lot, and that context has been getting lost and twisted in all the noise that has been swirling around this story. Let us start with exactly what LeBron said and why it lit everything up the way it did. LeBron was on a podcast talking about the physical reality of today's NBA. He said that the way the game is played now is completely different from how it was played in the 80s and 90s. He talked about how the pace is faster, how the game is more spread out, how players are moving more and sprinting more, and he pointed to something specific that really stood out. He said that calf injuries today are kind of like what high ankle sprains used to be years ago. When he came into the league, one of the biggest fears for athletic guards and forwards was landing on somebody's ankle when trying to get to the basket. Back then, the paint was packed. There were 4 or 5 big bodies sitting in there at all times. If you took off toward the basket and came down on somebody's foot wrong, you were looking at 4 to 6 weeks on the shelf with a high ankle sprain. LeBron said that because the game is now so open and spread out, that specific danger has gone down. But in its place, because of all the extra running and sprinting the modern game demands, calf injuries have become the new serious issue. And he said he hopes the league and his medical teams can figure out how to better handle that going forward. That is what was actually said. Taken purely on its own, it reads like a player who cares about player health and wants the league to understand what today's athletes are dealing with physically. But here is where it gets complicated, because the people who played in that older era did not hear a health discussion. What they heard was something that felt like a suggestion that today's game is harder than what they went through, that the demands now are greater than what they faced. And for a generation of players who dealt with hand checking, who played in an era where physical punishment was just expected and accepted, where nobody complained about how rough it was and nobody was trying to build a case that their era deserved extra sympathy, that kind of message hits completely different. To them, it does not sound like a health conversation. It sounds like a quiet way of saying their era was less demanding. And that, to players like Shaq, is absolutely unacceptable. Think about what Shaq and the players from his era actually went through. This was a time when defending your space meant using your body in ways the modern game simply does not allow anymore. Hand checking on the perimeter was legal. Big men in the paint were allowed to use physical force to hold their ground in ways that would draw foul calls immediately today. Every drive to the basket was a risk. Every post-up was a battle. Games were They earned their greatness by going through something real every single night on the court. So when LeBron made those comments, even if they were meant purely as a medical and performance observation, the old-school crowd heard something underneath it. They heard a suggestion that their grind somehow does not measure up, that what they went through is being quietly downgraded while today's game gets elevated. And for a man like Shaq, someone who spent years playing center in an era where centers were targeted physically every single night,
someone who won championships by physically breaking opposing teams down. That feeling of being dismissed, even indirectly, is something he was not going to ignore. And that is why that tunnel moment happened. Now let us talk about that tunnel. The Lakers had just taken a loss to the Knicks, 112-100. Not a devastating game, not some historic blow, just a regular season loss that on any other night would have been forgotten by the next morning. But that night was different. LeBron's podcast comments had already been circulating in circles where people do not let things like that pass without being addressed, and Shaq was in that building. Reports say that after the game, Shaq stepped directly into LeBron's path in the tunnel, not accidentally, not casually. He planted himself right there and made it clear that he had something to say. Now, picture that image for a second. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the most physically imposing people to ever play this game, standing in a tunnel and deliberately stopping someone in their tracks. That is not a friendly gesture. That is not a man looking to have a chill conversation. That is someone who felt like a line had been crossed and wanted to address it directly, personally, and immediately. That is the old school way of handling things. No media setup, no planned statement, no press release. Just face-to-face, right then, right there. What exactly was said in that tunnel is still not fully known. Different people who were nearby have shared bits and pieces of what went down, but nothing has been completely confirmed from both sides yet. What is clear, though, is the energy of that moment, and the energy was serious. And it pushed Shaq's long-standing position on LeBron and the GOAT debate right back to the center of the conversation in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. Because this was not just a media moment, this was personal. And when something gets personal between players at this level, it takes on a completely different weight. Now let us get into the real heart of Shaq's argument, because his issues with how LeBron is positioned in the GOAT conversation go much deeper than just one podcast comment. Shaq has always had a very clear and specific view of what greatness in basketball truly means. To him, it is not just about statistics. It is not just about how many points you score or how many years you stay in the league at a high level. To Shaq, true greatness at the highest level of basketball has always been about one specific thing: fear. The ability to make opponents feel like they had already lost before the game even really started. The kind of presence that gets into people's heads and stays there. And in his eyes, nobody did that better than Michael Jordan. Jordan did not just beat teams, he made them believe in their hearts that they were going to lose. That belief got planted before tip-off, and it grew stronger with every possession, every bucket, every cold stare. By the time the fourth quarter arrived in a close game, Jordan's opponents were not just dealing with the basketball situation in front of them. They were battling something inside their own heads, something he had put there through years of making teams feel helpless when he was locked in. That is a different kind of power, and it is very hard to measure with numbers.
You do not hear stories from players talking about losing sleep the night before facing LeBron. You do not hear the same kind of accounts of opponents feeling mentally broken, completely checked out, the way teams used to describe going up against Jordan and Kobe in their primes. And to Shaq, that difference is not a small thing. That is the entire conversation. Because if you cannot create that kind of fear, that kind of psychological dominance, then no matter how many records you break, the argument for putting you above those players will always have a hole in it that cannot be filled with statistics alone. Then there's the finals record, and Shaq leans on this very hard. Michael Jordan went 6-0 in the NBA Finals. 6 appearances, 6 championships, 6 Finals MVP awards, and 0 losses on that stage. Not one single slip. When the moment was at its absolute biggest, when the pressure was at its highest, and everything was on the line, Jordan delivered every single time, without exception. That kind of record is almost impossible to wrap your head around because it means that every single time Jordan got to the finals, he won it all.
No close calls that went the wrong way, no series where the other team just had a little more. 6 chances, 6 titles. Clean. Perfect. And that record carries an argument that is very hard to argue against on a purely logical level. LeBron's side absolutely has real arguments to make in response to all of this, arguments that cannot just be swept aside. His longevity alone is something we have never seen before. Staying elite across more than 20 years, across multiple different teams, across completely different systems and rosters, doing it in different roles as the league around him changed, that is an achievement nobody else in basketball history has matched. Jordan's career, legendary as it was, did not stretch the same way. Jordan stepped away from the game multiple times. His total time on the court does not compare to what LeBron has done in terms of years and consistency. And what LeBron has done statistically over that enormous stretch of time is genuinely without comparison. Nobody has done it for that long at that level. That is real. That counts. But Shaq's answer to that argument is sharp and direct. To him, accumulating numbers over a very long time is not the same thing as dominating your era. And this is the heart of where the disagreement really lives. If you believe that building up numbers and records over a very long career is equivalent to being the most dominant force in the game during your peak, then you can build a case for LeBron as the greatest of all time. But if you believe that peak dominance, peak fear, and peak control of an era are what define true greatness, then Jordan and Kobe sit in a different conversation entirely. Those are two genuinely different ways of measuring greatness, and neither side is completely wrong, but they lead to completely different conclusions. And that is exactly why this debate never ends, and why it gets more intense every single time someone pokes at it. Now, add to all of this what is happening with LeBron's current situation with the Lakers. The team is not built around him the way it used to be. At 41 years old, LeBron has naturally moved into a different kind of role. He is still smart, still impactful, still capable of big moments, but the team's identity is clearly shifting toward its future. Younger players are becoming the focal point. The franchise is thinking about the next chapter, and critics have absolutely noticed that shift. They point to it as part of the argument about legacy and how greatness ages, because when Shaq was dominating with the Lakers and winning those 3 straight championships, there was never any confusion about who the team was built around. That was Shaq's team. 3 titles in a row with Kobe as a powerful and essential piece alongside him, but never any real debate about who was.
That clarity was part of what made that run so impressive and so undeniable. The contrast to LeBron's current situation is something people are definitely using as part of this broader conversation. And then there are the jersey patches. LeBron has been wearing patches on his jersey this season to mark his records and milestones, the all-time field goals made record being one of them, with more reportedly on the way for other achievements he is chasing or has already locked in. And here is what makes this feel significant to the older generation of players. Nobody before LeBron ever did this. Not Jordan, not Kareem, not Wilt, not Bill Russell. None of the names that come up every single time the GOAT conversation starts. They hit their milestones, got their recognition, accepted the respect from the basketball world, and kept playing. They did not wear their achievements on their jerseys in real time while still active. And for players from that older era, the ones who were taught to let their game speak for itself without extra promotion, those patches feel very different. They feel like a statement. They feel like LeBron actively shaping how his legacy looks while he is still in the middle of building it. And Shaq is not the only one who finds that move uncomfortable. To people from a generation where you proved yourself through your play and trusted the game to reflect your greatness back honestly, wearing your accomplishments on your uniform feels like something from a completely different culture. And in many ways, it is. But here is the bigger point Shaq is actually making when you strip everything down to its core. This is not just about LeBron. This is about the entire shift in how the NBA operates and what gets celebrated now versus what used to matter. Today's league is not just basketball anymore. It is entertainment, branding, social media reach, highlight culture, documentary storytelling, and global celebrity all mixed together into something that doesn't really have a clear line separating the sport from the business. A player today can have hundreds of millions of followers, massive endorsement deals, their own production company, a global presence that reaches into every corner of the world, and still never be the most feared player in the league. Those things matter for business. They matter for building a brand. But in Shaq's eyes, they absolutely should not be used as evidence in a conversation about who was the greatest basketball player of all time, because none of that translates to what it felt like to go up against Jordan in the fourth quarter of a playoff game. None of that tells you what it was like to be on the court with Kobe when he decided he was going to take over and nothing was going to stop him. And that gap between cultural impact and basketball dominance is exactly where Shaq keeps pulling people back to every time this conversation gets going. The tunnel moment changed the tone of everything because it took this debate out of the safe space of talk shows and social media arguments and made it real and direct. Two people with enormous history in this sport facing each other in a tight hallway after a game, with no cameras invited, no PR teams managing the message, no carefully prepared statements, just two men and whatever had been building up between them. That is old school. That is the way disputes used to get handled before everything became a content moment. And that rawness is part of why people are paying so much attention to it. Because in a world where everything feels calculated and produced and shaped for public consumption, a genuine, unfiltered confrontation between legends carries a different kind of weight. People feel it differently, they respect it differently, and they remember it longer. The reaction to all of this was immediate, and it was everywhere. Former players started weighing in, analysts started forming sides, fans went deep into the debate online and in conversation. And the sides that formed were not just about who was right or wrong in this specific situation. They were about what people fundamentally believe greatness in basketball means. The old school side aligned with Shaq, saying that what he is defending is the standard that built the league, the standard of toughness and dominance and fear that made basketball the sport.
The modern side aligned with LeBron, saying that the game has genuinely evolved and that greatness today should be measured in ways that reflect how the game has changed. Neither side is willing to move, and that is why this conversation keeps getting louder instead of quieter. What younger players are seeing in all of this matters too, because this is not just a debate between retired legends and a current superstar. This is a real-time discussion about what the league values and what it will value going forward. The players who are coming up right now, the ones who are in the early or middle stages of their careers, they are watching how this plays out. They're seeing how legacy gets argued about, how respect gets given or taken back, how history gets shaped by moments like this. And that shapes how they think about their own careers and their own places in the game's history. When a figure as significant as Shaq draws a clear line and says, "This is what matters and this is where I stand," that matters to everyone in that world, whether they say so publicly or not. And now, with all of this fully out in the open, LeBron's every move carries extra weight. Every game he plays, every comment he makes in an interview, every decision about how he carries himself publicly, it all gets viewed through this new lens. People are watching to see how he responds. Does he address what Shaq said directly? Does he let his play speak for itself and move on? Does he send a message back in his own way through something subtle? Every option carries consequences. Every choice says something. And no matter what he does, people are going to read into it deeply. That is the level of pressure this moment has created, and it is not going away anytime soon. At the end of all of this, what this moment really is about is something that goes beyond basketball. It is about respect, about how generations see each other, about who gets to define what greatness means and how history gets written by moments like this. Shaq stepping up in that tunnel was not a random impulse. It was a man who has spent his entire life in this sport, who built his legacy through real battles on a real court, in real games against real competition, saying clearly that he is not comfortable with how certain things are being framed. And that message, delivered that directly in that setting, is something the basketball world is going to keep talking about for a long time. Because here's the truth. Nobody just wakes up one morning and becomes the greatest player of all time by breaking records while the game is in the middle of changing. The GOAT title is not inherited. It is not handed over because the numbers line up. It is earned through how you are remembered by the people who were inside the game with you, the people who played against you, the people who played beside you, the people who built the game before you showed up and understand what the standard actually felt like when it was being set at its highest. And right now, some of those people are making it very clear that they believe that standard is being misrepresented, that what the game used to demand is being quietly softened, and that the legacy of the people who built this sport through something raw and real and physically unforgiving deserves more than to be used as a comparison point in someone else's argument about why today is harder. Shaq made his stance clear. The tunnel moment made it real. And the conversation that started from one podcast comment has now grown into something much bigger than just two players going back and forth. It is about what basketball greatness really is. It is about which era deserves more credit and why. And it is about whether the biggest name in today's game is truly operating at the level of the legends who came before him, or whether the story being built around him is bigger than the truth it is based on. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Where do you stand on all of this?